All right, everyone, let's go ahead and get started this morning. This afternoon, this is a lunch and learn. All right, welcome to BikeWalkKC and Urban Trail Co's Into the Woods on Kansas City Trails. We're really excited to have Ann Pye and Brian Prosser of Urban Trail Co with us. This series is part of this meeting is part of our virtual series that we're offering during the pandemic. We're all at home. This is an excellent chance for us all to learn. The pandemic is accelerating a lot of trends that we're seeing, and some of them were already in motion to begin with. So our series is a conversation with leaders in Kansas City about how that acceleration is happening locally for transportation and health and equity and sustainability issues that are really core to BikeWalkKC's mission, as well as some of the intersectional issues that often overlap with what we do, including things like racism, housing, economic development, and more. So one of the trends that's really popping right now is trail use, right? So the place to get exercise and find recreation and find some fresh air and peace and happiness is out on the trails, where you can stay away from people, keep a good safe social distance, physical distance, and still have a really good time. So we're so excited to have Ann Pye and Brian Prosser here with us today. This is going to be recorded, so we'll share that later. And we can park our questions in the chat box that you'll see. And I will pick those up and share those with our host today. And we'll have a question to answer towards the end of it. And we'll also, if you wouldn't mind in the chat box as well, introducing yourself and saying, if you're from representing an organization today, we'd love to hear about that. If you really love your neighborhood trail or perhaps a trail across the metro, tell us about that trail you love and some of your favorite experiences on it. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to have Eric Rogers get us started, our Executive Director at BikeWalkKC.
Thank you, Liz, and welcome everybody. We're excited for this one. I know for me personally, one of the things that's keeping me sane during the pandemic and staying at home is being able to get outside into our local parks and especially our trails. So I'm really excited for this one. We'll hear a little bit about what Urban Trail Co is, but I want to make sure everybody understands that it's a small nonprofit. It's all volunteer, and so all of the amazing trails around the region that we're going to talk about that Kansas City is so fortunate to have are thanks to the hard work of all of the volunteers at Urban Trail Co. So I'm just going to jump right in and turn it over to Ann and Brian. I think Ann is going to have a pop quiz to start us off with today. Go ahead, Ann.
Well, I was going to ask for a show of hands, but I noticed most people don't have video on, so we're not going to do that.
Okay.
But I'll make some assumptions. If you're here, it's because you love being outdoors and you want to know more about the trails. So what we're going to talk about today is a little bit about how the trails came to be in Kansas City, what trails we're talking about, what are some important ways that people can get the most enjoyment out of trails and also help protect and extend the lives of these trails that we love, and maybe a little bit of insider info. So I'm Ann Pye. I'm the Executive Director of Urban Trail Co. I serve as a volunteer, and Brian Prosser, here with us today, is the current president of the board of UTC. So thanks. Before we get going too far, I want to say thanks to BikeWalkKC for hosting this. And thanks to all their incredible sponsors who we saw listed on the slide. If you don't mind, go ahead and throwing that back up there for a second. Give a shout out to these people, as well as the sponsors of Urban Trail Co. As Eric mentioned, we're a really small nonprofit. And when we talk about who sponsors trails and who makes this financially possible, it's primarily individuals who love the trail who give small amounts. And the same is true, I think, with BikeWalkKC. We depend on our communities to keep the work going. So there are far too many people to thank there, but that's how that works. we have some friends who help, and we have a huge community who sponsors us. So Liz, if you don't mind flashing over to the slide deck, we'll just go ahead and get started. And when we were getting ready for this presentation, one of the things that Brian mentioned was that when we say trails, a lot of people think of paved trails, right, Brian?
Yeah, that's right. That's definitely a common theme.
So we're not talking today about paved trails. Those are wonderful trails. Kansas City is chock-a-block with them. We're talking about natural surface trails that are dirt surfaces in the woods. And we're talking about a few very specific trails around Kansas City, and we'll show you a list of those here in a little bit. These trails are typically built in public parks because the parks have a lot of land that is steep. Around here, we have river bluffs, and this land can't be used for things like soccer fields and baseball fields and buildings. But the parks very much want to get as many amenities as they can into their parkland so they can serve people. So one of the things that works really well for parks is for trails to come in. And the trails are typically built on land that can't be used other ways, and they're sustainably built to withstand erosion forces. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means. But that's what a trail is when we're talking about trails. It's a ribbon of dirt in the woods, often marked with roots and rocks and interesting things. Brian, you got anything more on what a trail is and what to expect when you go out and see trails in the woods?
Yeah, we do in Kansas City. We're really blessed with a variety of terrain that tends to be fairly rocky, which can be very interesting for folks that want to get out in the woods and experience something a little bit different, a little bit more natural. So, in terms of what to expect, I think each trail system is a little bit different based on its specific location and what kind of exact terrain it has, how much rock might be embedded into that area. So, Ann and I talked about it's always good to kind of do some reconnaissance on a trail system before you go out, just so you're prepared for the type of excursion that you want to experience. Some trails tend to be a little bit less elevation, a little bit less rock and roots, a little bit easier to navigate. Others tend to be what we call quite technical, which means that there may be a lot of rock embedded into the terrain. There may be a lot of elevation change, so it ends up being more difficult. So it's kind of one of those, practical advice. Know before you go is always good advice.
So one of the key points that we're going to come back to, and I noticed Laura Steele's comment about loving the Lawrence River Trail. So that's an example of a trail that's very flowing and non-technical. You get a lot of miles with just a very smooth experience and a little bit of surprise and delight
Yeah.
with some turns.
Yeah.
So Ann, could I jump in and
Sure.
ask you to explain a little bit more what you mean by technical or not technical?
Does
that mean easy and hard?
Yeah, I'll take that one on. So what we mean
if
by
it's as simple as easy or difficult.
So if you look at the picture on the slide, that is non-technical. That's
that's it looks very flat. It's very straightforward. It's very smooth. It's very bedded into the soil. But what you don't see on that particular trail is any roots that may have been exposed. You don't see any rock outcroppings. So as Ann pointed out, that would be a very straightforward, what we call an easier type trail. And the way that we designate trails around Kansas City is we don't use generally a standardized color coordination or difficulty level with diamonds and shapes and things like that. We generally just say that they're easier, more difficult, and very difficult. So that's something to be aware of as well. So as you progress from easier to more difficult, you'll find exposed roots, you'll find rock features, We don't necessarily call them obstacles because we feel like they're, an interesting part of the terrain, so we call them features. And as you progress to more difficult trails, you'll see larger rock features where the trail has really been designed to make use of the natural terrain through rock outcroppings or different areas and rock features. So that's generally what we're talking about in terms of the progression from easy to more difficult.
Now, this brings up an interesting point. It actually kind of segues into what we're going to talk about next is when we talk about easy, intermediate, difficult, Brian and I come to this from a mountain biking perspective, and there's a very good reason for that. We'll talk about how these trails got started. So when we say easy trail, an easy trail to a hiker and a difficult trail to a hiker may mean a different thing. It may mean that it's very steep or that there are exposures. Easy, intermediate, difficult to a mountain biker who is moving faster and dealing with wheels that are going over these features, it's a little bit different. Now, why do we think about this from a mountain biking perspective? Let's peel all the way back to the early 1990s. Mountain bikes were invented within the previous decade. They'd only been around for a little bit. Mountain bikers, if they wanted a place to go ride their bikes, had to build the trails. And that's where the trails started. These trails started in Kansas City was through mountain bikers who wanted a place to ride and began having these conversations with parks departments about developing these trails. Now, the parks departments want trails that serve everyone. So these trails have been developed as usable and wonderful for hikers and runners and anyone who just wants to be out in the outdoors. So when you see mountain bikers on the trail, a lot of people, sometimes we encounter people who don't realize that mountain bikers actually belong on the trail and don't understand that mountain biking is very much in the DNA of these trails. This is how it got started here in Kansas City. So we can, I think from there, go on to the next slide and talk about how what UTC is and how we got formed and kind of how the business of trail building works around here. So Urban Trail Company is a 501c3 nonprofit. We're 100% volunteer. Volunteers put in about 10,000 hours annually, and it's a group of, say, between 200 and 300 core people who you can count on to be there day in and day out, and as many as 1,000 total. This group of volunteers maintains a little over 200 miles right now at 18 trails around Kansas City. And the way we operate is we have a 7-member board. It's a very small official organization. We have a 7-member board that holds legal agreements with the Parks Department. So Urban Trail Company promises that we will recruit and maintain a volunteer base to keep these trails in good shape, and that we're going to build them to some safe and sustainable standards. And the Parks Departments, from their side, agree that these trails can be open and publicly accessible for biking and for hiking. So the Parks Departments actually own the trails in the land, and they have the final say on anything that happens on those trails in that land. And Urban Trail Company volunteers build and maintain the trails. So that's how the partnership works. Let's go on. Okay, so here are all the land managers that we deal with, except for one. We don't have the Lee Summit logo on here. They're the newest land manager who invited us to come build a trail, and that's at Legacy Park. So why do the Parks Departments have these trails? They want trails in their parks. They want to serve the public this way. They don't have the internal resources and the budgets that it takes to build and maintain trails. Like I said, 10,000 volunteer hours, and honestly, that is just the trail maintenance hours. That's not the hours it takes in relationships and partnerships and fielding emails and doing all those things. So it's a good partnership. The parks need the help of a volunteer organization to organize volunteers and carry the insurance that goes with those volunteer activities. So back in those early days, trail users who were primarily mountain bikers started to go show up at parks board meetings. And Eric and Liz, I bet you'll nod your, that's a lot of the way things happen. People show up at the Parks Board meetings. People show up at the city council meetings and say, this is what we want as citizens. And those voices really do get heard. And it really is important for people to say what they want. So in the early days, we lobbied to get trails into the parks, built a reputation as being responsible stewards of public land. And now parks are coming to us and asking for more trails to get built. So let's look at where some of these trails are. I think the long list is on the next slide. So these are the trails we're talking about. If you know these parks, if you've been to these parks, these are the trails where you can go and explore. They're all over the metro, from Smithville down to the southern end of Blue River Parkway, from the west, DeSoto, to the east, Blue Springs, and all points in between. So if you've got any questions about any specific trails on this list, we could love to field those. And we'll go ahead and go on a little bit here from that. So when we talk about sustainable trails, so the reason the parks trust us to go in and help build trail is that back in the early days when this started, how this started was a group of mountain bikers approached International Mountain Bike Association, IMBA, who have a trail building training program. It's been ongoing for more than 20 years, and said, come teach us how to build trail. And we took on a couple of projects where we learned to build trail and cut our teeth on it and started building the tools and equipment in the volunteer base. You can't just go out and throw dirt wherever you want to, or scrape dirt off wherever you want to in the woods and have it last for 20 years, have it last for 100 years, because we have a continual, perpetual enemy of dirt, and that's water. And here in Kansas City, that enmity is acute and ever present. So there are techniques that we learn to build a trail so that it will last for tens and dozens and scores and half centuries of time with minimal maintenance. Brian, can you talk a little bit about our local soil and what we deal with in terms of erosion, both wet and dry conditions?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Ann, because we, fortunately or unfortunately, have a unique soil composition in Kansas City. So, you know, in some ways, our actual soil is more of our enemy than water. You know, for those particularly that travel around the U.S. and internationally and have been on trails where they're open while it's raining or when it's wet, maybe wondering, well, why do we close trails? You know, what are the challenges and issues? It's really comes to the fact that we have an extremely high clay content in our soil, which means that when it rains or wet, kind of hold on to that water, and it is easily pulled up when it's disturbed, either footprint or tire. So when the soil is wet, that kind of contact creates immediate damage. And so it pulls up that top layer of dirt off of what we call the tread of the trail, really just, you know, that top surface that you're walking, hiking, running, or riding on. So that's our biggest challenge, and that's the reason why we have to close trails while they're wet. Mm-hmm. And in terms of how we built these trails, as Ann pointed out, you know, we use national standards, primarily the U.S. Forest Service standards, but we also, through over 20 years of trail building experience, also understand the uniqueness of the soil and rock composition in our area. So we built up that knowledge base across our trail builders, and that really helps inform what we can and really can't do in the Kansas City area, which, you know, is a little bit different than any other area of the country. Mm-hmm.
So yeah. One of the things that I do a lot of hikes with people to talk about how the trail was built. And one of the things that surprised me at first, that was an eye-opener, people, was how much of the trail was on purpose. Because when you're out hiking, it just seems like the trail happened. And that's the hallmark of a really well-built trail. When you're walking through a rock garden, some of those rocks were discovered, others were put there. When you find step-ups on a trail, some of those rocks were put there. Why does the trail go to the left side of a tree instead of the right side of a tree? There are reasons for all of these things. And every foot of that trail has been sweated over and obsessed over in the design phase. We spend a lot of time when there's new trails scouting. And you would not believe how long trail builders can stand and talk about which side of a tree the trail should go on. And there are reasons why, because we want to slow down the process of erosion. Sorry, Brian?
Yeah. Oh, no, I was going to say we shouldn't talk so much. We should just design and build.
We should just design and build. So let's go on to the next slide. So as Brian was saying earlier, when we talk about user experiences on the trail and what can make a trail experience more enjoyable. And as Liz said earlier, we've seen a just dramatic increase of the trails during the pandemic because it is a place that people can go and be relatively safe and enjoy the outdoors and be with their families and enjoy the outdoors. So a lot of people are new to the idea of trail recreation. One of the things that can help you, have a map, know before you go, like Brian was saying, have a map before you go. Urban Trail Company, we try to put descriptions of the trails. Each trail we're a little bit behind, but most of the trails have descriptions about what kind of character they're gonna have. So you can know, you can ask on, most of the trails have Facebook pages where you can ask other trail users, what is this going to be like when we get there? Because what you don't want is to get your 5-year-old 6 miles away from the trailhead and not know how to get back. Take plenty of water when you're in hot weather. Know whether the trail is, kind of try to check it out and see whether the trail is going to be steep or rocky before you get there. Understand what kind of physical experience you're going to have. Trail etiquette, do assume that you're going to see mountain bikers, that you're going to see hikers, that you're going to see runners. And all of these people are out there to have a great experience the way you are. So what we can best do is try to promote the other person's good experience, make eye contact. There are lots of finicky rules about who should yield to who on uphill and downhill, but the main thing is make eye contact and communicate so you can pass each other safely. If you're mountain biking, there should be signs pretty much everywhere at the trails. Ride within your limits, wear a helmet. There's a pretty high risk reward thing going on when you land on a rock on your head. So, you know, wear a helmet. See folks who think that it's, you know, makes you look uncool not to wear a helmet, but people who've been mountain biking a long time know that shows that you know what you're doing. So that's all I've got on the topic of know before you go. I think Brian touched on it earlier. And then we'll move on to something really, really important that we want you all to know. And every new trail user, please don't use wet or muddy trails. We do have status that can be checked. We'll show a couple of slides of that here in a second. So like Brian was saying, our soils are clay. Now, think about, when I talk to kids, I usually have these jars. One has sand and one has garden soil and one has clay in it. And I pour water into the sand and gravel mix and the water just goes right to the bottom. And I pour water in the one that's a little bit heavier soil and water kind of soaks in fast and goes to the bottom. I pour water in the clay and it sits on the top and it just sits there. And if I bring that jar back a month later, the water will still be sitting on top. It doesn't percolate. The water doesn't go down through the soil. It wants to sit on the top. It also, clay has really, really small particles. You wouldn't think it does. You'd think heavy soil has big particles. Man, I think gravel at this end, big particles. Clay is at this end, small particles. So when water hits it, it takes those small particles and just takes them right off the trail. So what happens when we put a footprint or a rut in the trail is it disturbs the surface and it makes those small particles loose and there they go. They're off the trail. So when you put a rut or a footprint in a wet or muddy trail, you're A, making the trail go away faster, and B, you're making it hold water longer because paradoxically, like Brian was saying, this weird soil we have, you put a print in it and you've compacted part of it. So that's going to hold water, which makes it even take longer to open the trail. So there's a big sermon about why we don't like that. We also then have to ask volunteers to go fix all the footprints and all the ruts. And what volunteers want to be doing? Riding their bikes, hiking, running, and doing their volunteer work, which the more minimal, the better. We go out and maintain trail because we like to hike and run and ride our bikes. So that's why we ask people not to use wet or muddy trails, and to make it easier for people to know when it's okay and when it isn't, our volunteer network maintains trail status. So I think we have the next slide of that. This is our current status from this morning after the rain. So I'm not sure if Iola is still open at this point or St. Joe. I don't know what's going on there. But at every trail all around the city, there are 2 or 3 volunteers at minimum who keep an eye on the trail conditions. When it's too wet, they close the trail. They mark the trail status closed. When it's okay to open, as soon as it's okay to open, they mark the trail status open. Now you can see this trail status a few ways. You can go to urbantrailco.com, and this is the home page that you're seeing right now. You can go to Rain Outline, which has a mobile app on your phone, and then you're 1 click away from seeing the current status everywhere. Or if you're on Twitter, you can follow KC Trail Status. That's our Twitter handle. And all of these are going to be on a slide, so if you want to review that later, you can. And it's also on our website, all of the ways to check the trail status. I like Twitter because I'm a Twitter user and I can get notifications through my Twitter account. So I can see immediately if, what's going on. We get questions occasionally about, is the trail's been marked closed for 5 days, is it still really closed? The posted status is the current status. The trail volunteers, they want to be out there riding as much as and hiking as much as anybody else, but they want to make sure that damage is prevented, so they mark it closed. I had a question for Brian right then, and it just skipped my mind. You reading my mind, Brian? What would you like? What would you like people to know about trail status?
I don't know if you mentioned it, but most people ask, if the trail status hasn't been updated for several days or a week or so.
Yeah.
The trail status, why hasn't it been updated? Well, generally speaking, the trail manager only updates it if the status has changed. So the status is what the status is. I know in this day and age, everybody loves like up to the minute information, but that's just not the way it works, because if it's open, it's open. If it's closed until it changes.
Now, you can get kind of good if you're watching this presentation and you're a veteran trail user, you know that you can watch things like stormwatch.com to know how much rain fell. So if you're going to work in the morning and you're wondering, is the trail getting close? Will it be open this afternoon? We'll talk a little bit about, or, should I throw my running gear in the car? Should I plan to go for a run after work? It's closed now, but things have been dry for a while. What do I expect? So there's a what not to do and a what to do in that case. The what not to do, please do not email the trail manager or trail steward and say, is the trail open? Is the trail open? Is the trail open? Is the trail going to be open? Because they're getting that. And
yeah. Or go on social media or Facebook or something like that, whatever you're into.
Mm-hmm. So, Brian, I don't know about your strategy. Mine has always been, if I think it's getting close, I'm prepared.
Yeah, definitely.
And then I just keep an eye on it. Some days you miss it, you decide to go home, ride, trail didn't open, and as soon as you hit your front door at home, the trail opens. And that's kind of what we live with in Kansas City. And we live with that in order to have trails that are going to last for 10 or 12 or 15 or 20 or 50 years.
Yeah, and I'll say that it's a little bit of an inexact science. You know, we rely on the trail managers for each trail system and their judgment. I mean, because they built the trail and maintain the trail with their volunteer crew, they know best. Sometimes, as Ann said, if you get home and we're planning on riding and things are closed, or you didn't plan on riding and they open right away, you get frustrated. But just know that we have the best interest for the long-term health and viability of the trails in mind. Sometimes it may seem like it's a little conservative. Sometimes you may go out there and wonder, well, gee, why is this trail open? It seems a little wet. Again, it's not an exact science.
Well, and two, this is something we hear from trail stewards that they wish people knew, is that the first 20 yards of a trail may be fine, but that there may be problem spots that stay wet a little bit further in the trail to that if you open it up are going to be trashed and have to be rerouted.
Yeah, that's a good point, Ann. You know, a lot of these trail systems are fairly large, and so you'll see some fairly significant changes in soil mechanics from one area of the trail over several miles to another area of the trail that's in a different part of the park or downstream or whatever the case may be. So we absolutely have to keep that in mind.
So before we go on, I'm going to introduce another concept here because we're kind of touching on, we're talking about these trail stewards who monitor the trails. And sometimes we get the, well, how do I do that? How can I would love to go help monitor the trail. So first of all, monitoring the trail doesn't mean you get to ride the trail when it's closed to see if it's openable. So just in case that, because people do kind of get that idea in their heads, like, oh, if I monitor the trail, then I can ride well. That's not really the way it works. But I'm going to introduce a concept here that we'll touch on again, which is try to get to know who the trail stewards are. If you are interested in helping with a particular trail and you don't know the trail steward, email us info@urbantrailco.com. We'll be happy to hook you up. Sign up on the volunteer list. That's not a foolproof way to get started because all of these different volunteers have different ways that they manage these massive amounts of communication in their free time. But get to know your trail stewards. Talk to them. Show up at a work day. Get to talk to them. Introduce yourself. Building that interpersonal trust is the way that you get involved in trail work, is the way that you get involved in these trail crews. So we'll talk about a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Can I hit the next? I think the next slide may be oh, there it is, trail status. So we've, I think, covered all this, but we'll sit here for a second and enjoy this beautiful picture of Swope. I didn't have to really figure that out. I knew that was Swope. So we're featuring some of its incredible rock formations and bluffs. All right, we've covered trail status in depth, so we can keep going on. So let's talk about what we do as volunteers in trail work. It's the fun part. There are people in our midst who consider themselves primarily mountain bikers. Some are primarily hikers, some are primarily runners, and some now consider themselves primarily trail builders because it is such a fun thing to do in the outdoors. It's such a great way to be outdoors and be active, especially in the winter months when a lot of other things are closed down and unavailable. So the fall and winter season is when we do new trail construction. Summer is when we do trail maintenance. And both of these seasons are very, very important. The volunteers who may enjoy the summer activities may not enjoy the fall ones. So Brian, what are some of the things that, well, first of all, why we do work in the fall, I'll cover that real quick. It's because we need to wait for the leaves to be off the trees to see what we're doing with the dirt. We need to wait for the bugs to die down before anybody wants to be out there. We need to wait for heat and humidity to be gone before it's safe to go out and exert yourself. When you're doing trail work in the winter, it can be a 20-degree day. I want to say even a 15, but that's pretty hardcore, but easily 20-degree day. And you'll be in your shirt sleeves, like t-shirt sleeves, because the work is so active. Brian, what are some of the kinds of things that a new volunteer might do on a trail work day in the fall and winter?
So I would say a new volunteer would be probably paired up with an experienced trail builder, and probably tackle some maintenance issues at first. So for example, if we have a long-standing trail that needs a little bit of help in terms of getting it back to the standards that we expect, and that could mean that we need to fix any ruts, any damage that's been done over the course of the spring and summer season. As the soil erodes, as it's going to do no matter what we do, some trails end up what we call berming, so it looks kind of like a cup instead of a flat surface. We call that method of fixing it deberming, so we kind of knock down the outer lip. That's other work that can be done. And then once we progress from there, we would introduce the new trail builder or new volunteer to actual new trail construction, which could be clearing corridor, which means that we're laid out a new trail. We need to take care of any little bushes or tree limbs that might get in the way. Move deadfall, which is tree limbs that have fallen across the trail. Kind of that first stage work of getting a trail corridor ready to actually build the trail. And then once we progress from that, we would introduce trail building techniques to the new volunteer, which includes bench cutting, and that's really where you want to end up with a nice, clean tread like you see in this picture. And there are techniques that we introduce the new trail builder to make that happen.
So what this translates into, and thank you, Brian, that's a really good big overview of all of the tasks that you do. Yeah. That's a lot to cover, is you'll come out, a brand new trail, you'll see, if you look at this picture, if this trail were not here yet, but we were going to build it, you would see bits of colored tape wrapped around the trees. And you would have a hand tool in your hand. It's got a long handle and a heavy head of some kind. It might be a tool just used for scraping dirt, or it might be a tool that looks more like an axe with an axe on one side and a hoe on the other side. And these tools are used for scraping dirt, for cutting out roots, for removing rocks. You might use something that looks like a big pickaxe. That again has a scraper head on the other side. You might use that for moving rocks or removing smaller rocks. And you're going to carry tools in and out of the woods. We do have some videos online. I don't have the URLs to those videos because we just now got our YouTube channel. And so we're going to link to those on our YouTube channel. But I believe you can find them from the UTC Facebook page. So sign up on our Facebook page, sign up through the volunteer. We're going to be pushing those out again this fall. Summer trail maintenance, what we're talking about is trimming. So let's go on to the next slide. So this is a trail that could probably use a little trimming here in this picture. When we say trail trimming, what we do is we take a big industrial trimmer. It's your little weed eater at home in the garage has scary dreams about the size of the trimmer that we use to trim trails. The line is thick. I was going to say what is thick as. It's the trimming line is very thick. And it will cut through branches up to a 1/4 inch thick. These things are powerful. They will throw rocks, the length of your house. They're crazy how powerful they are. And so it feels really cool to go and use one of these things. So volunteers go out, and we've been trying to track statistics of hours, but no 2 miles are quite alike. And so I think that the easiest mile, you're probably talking about 4 hours to trim that mile. Sound about right, Brian? 4 or 5 hours.
Yeah. I mean, we're talking both sides of the trail. So generally, we'll take 2 volunteers and kind of attack each side at the same time. Or if it's a single volunteer, you may go down one side and then turn around and go down the other side.
So in the early summer, you'll start to see calls from the volunteer leaders to please sign up for trimming, please come out to trimming parties. Please, this is the #1 volunteer need for trails. We need people because when you think we have more than 200 miles to maintain, that's 400 miles of trimming. So when we say 4 to 5 hours to trim an easy mile, that's both sides. So, you know, that takes in both sides of the trail, but it takes a lot of hours. And this is a case where many hands make light work, and trimming is not hard to learn. There are some techniques to doing it well, and it's incredibly beneficial to the trail. So if we did not trim a trail for 1 year, it would be unpleasant for people to go use that trail, and it would be less used. 2 years, the trail overgrows. 3 years, you can't see where the trail was anymore unless you look really, really hard. So if we can't maintain the trails we have, they will just naturally go away. It's very important. Trails, trimming them keeps, it helps with erosion. It helps with, it helps the trails dry out quicker, keeps the bugs off the trail. They're just nicer. They're nicer to use. And so if you're a person who does not mind heat and sweating in the heat, trail trimming is just a really wonderful way to get involved. And honestly, it's one of the most satisfying things you can do, because you go in and you have conquered a jungle and made it something beautiful when you finish. Even if you do just a little pit, it is incredible just to look back and see the achievement you've done. So Brian, anything to add on trimming? How's Shawnee Mission looking? I know that you do a lot of work out there with maintaining that trail.
Yeah, I do. We've had the luxury of having the trail running group really help us out over the last couple of years. So, you know, that's a big part of what we do as a board and the trail managers as well, is to get groups involved and depending on their interests. So, yeah, it's in great shape right now. I encourage everybody to get out there and use it since they just trimmed it. So.
I see Carl's comment here that the Shawnee Mission trails were looking really good last week. Thank you, Carl.
Yeah, thank the running group for that.
Thank the running group.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, it kind of goes to the point that when you get involved, you can kind of pick and choose what you want to do because there's so much to do. You know, I tend to spend a lot of time in the winter, particularly at Shawnee Mission Park, repairing things, just making the trail better based on the type of weather patterns we have and what damage was done. So that's where I spend most of my time. I also spend a good deal of time building new trail. I think you saw in a previous slide that we've got a new trail system out at Cedar Nile, so I've done some work out there. So yeah, I mean, whenever you pitch in, you can kind of get involved how you want to.
Mm-hmm. So my trail building love, I do like to trim. I like to gear up and go do that. But in the winter, I like bench cutting, where you scrape little bits of dirt off. It's finesse work, just scrape tiny bits off until the trail looks great. I like, I'll go out, a trail crew may build, say, 20 yards of trail that day, and I will pull one rock out of the trail, but man, nobody else had to do it. And just the physical nature of moving rock is a lot of fun. So I really like rock work, and building armored sections, I think, is a lot of fun.
Yeah. Yeah, and an armored section is where you piece together rocks almost like a puzzle to cover an area that may be more susceptible to damage from water, whatever the case may be. And yeah, that's a lot of fun to kind of play those mind puzzle games.
Yeah. So that's an interesting, next time you're out on your favorite trail and you see a place where rock has been placed like that, take a second and stop and look. Because what a lot of people don't realize is that's not flat rock that got placed on top of the ground. Those rocks are usually at least 6 inches deep. So you've got big, massive pieces of rock that people just like you went into the woods, found it, went, oh, this is the perfect rock for this, hauled it all the way back to that spot, dug out 6 to 8 inches deep so the rock would sit there and not move when a tire or a foot hit it. And thinking about how connected we are to each other in this way is really, really powerful. When we're out using a trail, you're connected to the awesome day that that person had digging a hole in the ground and putting in a rock that wasn't going to move and wasn't going to move for 10 or 20 or 15 or 50 years, no matter how many people stepped on it. And that's one of the amazing things about trails to me. So,
well, and folks, it's amazing how much you all do and the sheer number of volunteers and the hours that everybody puts in. I'm curious to know how, Kansas City might compare to other places. My sense is we have an amazing amount of trails for the size of our city, and it sounds like we probably have one of the larger groups of volunteers in Urban Trail Co.
I suspect you're right about the number of volunteers being large. Brian, I'll let you tackle the question first, and then Oliver, you've ridden more places than I have.
Yeah.
How does the amount of trail compare to other places you've been?
I think it stacks up favorably against some of the more well-known international destinations in the U.S. It really is a hidden gem in the center of our country. I don't think people realize how much is actually out there within like an hour radius. So like if you're in the middle of the city, you could probably shoot out for 30 minutes in any direction and hit a really awesome trail system. So from the sheer amount of trail systems we have to the amazing terrain that we have, it is really one of the top places to ride and hike and run and whatnot. We do have a unique approach to how we build and maintain trail with the agreements as a 501c nonprofit that we have with all the land management agencies, which I think, Ann, at one time you did some investigation into that, and the way that we're structured and how we accomplish all this, we've really built a model that is unique in the country. I mean, no one else does it this way. So, it's pretty amazing how that's worked and how it continues to expand.
So there are places that use the same kind of MOU agreements. What's unique about Kansas City is how the volunteer structure is broken out into regions. So we have 5 regions: north, south, east, west, and then central. So north, think Smithville and Hodge. West, think Shawnee Mission and DeSoto and Olathe. Central, Kessler, Roanoke, Rosarts. East would be Jacomo and Landau, and south would be Blue River and Swope. And each of these regions has its own volunteer leaders who have their own relationship with the land manager. So a lot of other places in the country have more trail than we do. A lot of places have more trail than we do. But it'll be trail at 2 or 3 locations, not trail at 18 locations across such a big geographic area. And that's really unique. So what makes Kansas City really special as a trails destination? Wrong word. We're not a trails destination because of our weather. We field questions all winter long from people from Omaha and from Minneapolis saying, can we come ride your trails in 2 weeks? I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can ride here in 2 weeks. That's why we're not a trails destination, because you can't plan a trip to Kansas. If you want to mountain bike somewhere, you can't plan a trip to Kansas City even 2 weeks in advance and know that you're going to be able to ride or run or hike. What you can do is live here and work here and know that on most days you can find a trail to get to that's close to your house that's going to be as good a trail experience as anywhere you can find.
Yeah, I would say that the quality of trails that we build, because they are hand built, and we take advantage of our terrain, just from an actual trail standpoint, besides being on top of a mountain, I would put them up against just about anything in the country. So it's just a fantastic experience. And like Ann said, it's a huge amenity that we have as residents of Kansas City.
One thing that we don't, oh, sorry, go ahead.
We've had a couple of questions about some of your favorite trails. So while we're talking about some of our great trails that we have all over and possibly in our own backyards, can you guys share some of your favorite trails or favorite experiences you've had on the trails? I know, that's a really big question. Tell me about like 2 favorite trails or 2 favorite experiences, or limit it in some way.
Well, I'll start with that question, then flip it over to Ann. You know, what I love about Kansas City is, depending on my mood and what kind of riding or running or hiking experience I want, I can pick a trail system that's fairly close. So my home trail that I spent most of my time on is Shawnee Mission Park. And the reason why I love that trail is because it has a variety of terrain, right? So you've got certain trail sections that are a little bit flatter, a little bit more mellow, and then you have others that are, you know, a lot of elevation change, a lot of rock, it's very scenic. And so I can put together an experience that incorporates all of that. Now, if I wanted something that's, you know, a little bit more straightforward, maybe I'll go to Lexington Lake Park. And if I want something that's a little more extreme, maybe I'll go to the more difficult parts of Blue River or Swope. So I kind of just pick and choose and tailor my experience depending on my mood on any given day.
That's pretty much what I was going to say, is that Kansas City offers this great palette of trails. And I noticed earlier, Liz, was it you that said loved Hidden Valley? Yeah. So there are trails that when you get to know them, you can recommend, you know, you can talk to your friend and go, oh, okay, what kind of, oh, Hidden Valley would be perfect for you today. You want something that feels kind of otherworldly, and you're really suddenly remote and in this experience and seeing trees you've never seen before and flowers you've never, Hidden Valley's great. You want just to get on your bike and flow for a long way, just go. Waco, especially if you don't mind climbing a little bit. Wyandotte County or Lawrence, go to those trails. Shawnee Mission is my home trail as well. I've got a new soft spot in my heart for Lexington Lake. That's one of our newer trails. Volunteers built that out to 10 miles in just about in under 4 years' time, which is really remarkable. And there's a glacial erratic on the trail, which I love. It's a huge pink, get my hands out of the frame, huge pink granite rock that got pushed down here by the glaciers when there were glaciers. So it's right on the side of the trail, and you can see cool things like that. And I like Lexington too, because it's got a good balance of really rocky, chunky, interesting terrain and flowing through the woods terrain.
Yeah, and I was going to add to the experience question. You know, one thing I love about going out on trails is you never know what you're going to run into. So, for example, yesterday I was riding Shawnee Mission Park and encountered a 2-foot copperhead snake, and it was absolutely beautiful. And there's also a flock of wild turkeys out there that you'll encounter occasionally, and you can chase them down the trail. They're very fast. You know, I've seen owls, I've seen red-tailed hawks. I actually chased a bobcat one time. They're fast as well. So you just never know what you're going to encounter. Obviously, there's lots of deer around here, but you know, that's all part of the experience and part of what we love about getting outdoors.
There was a really good article. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say we are about out of time, so I'm going to throw out the last question. It's probably not a quick one, but we'll see how quick you guys can answer it. James is asking about trail etiquette, and as a hiker, what should you know about being on a trail with a mountain bike who's probably going a lot faster than you are, and you might feel like you're in their way? What should you do?
Yeah, you know, there are some specific rules for mountain bike riders in terms of yielding. And, you know, yielding doesn't necessarily mean you just stop, but You know, bikes are supposed to take into account anything in front of them. So, you know, you yield to hikers, you yield to runners. And really what that means is you just take precautions in slowing down so that all trail users can kind of get around each other in a way that makes sense, you know? So you use common sense. So for example, if I'm coming up on a runner as a rider or a hiker, I will slow down and provide as much room as possible for all of us to get around each other. In terms of etiquette among bikers, we always yield to the biker that's coming uphill rather than downhill. So the bike that's going downhill really needs to slow down and make as much effort to get out of the way as of the bike that's actually climbing, because it's obviously more difficult to climb, and if you have to stop and regain your momentum, that's particularly difficult. So those are the rules among bikers. But yeah, I mean, it's basically common sense. Slow down.
It really
yield.
does help to make eye contact if you can, and just kind of negotiate that, because there's a little bit of calculus. When I'm hiking or running, if a bike is coming and I can see it's going to make that pass quicker and safer if I step off a little bit, I'm not going to insist that the biker stop for me and make a deal about it. Let's negotiate this so we're both safe, so that we're both still enjoying the experience as much as we can. And make eye contact and say, hey, have a good day. I'll never forget. So Brian was actually the person who got me started in mountain biking. And I haven't forgotten a lot of advice that he gave me. And I asked him this same question about what do I do? And I'll never forget. He's like, sometimes you'll run into a real trail turd out there who just has a bad attitude about meeting people. But most of the time, people want others on the trail to be having a good experience, and we'll help each other make that happen.
Yeah. Yeah, don't let one bad apple, you know, ruin your experience. You know, after all these years, it happens to me very rarely, but it's going to happen. But I would say 98% of people out there are very generous and accommodating.
Well, that's a really good note to end on. So I want to kick it back over to Liz, but first say thank you to Brian and Ann for joining us and sharing all this great information. I've learned a lot, and I know a lot of the folks here have as well. Take it away, Liz.
Thanks, Rogers. Thanks, Ann, and thanks, Brian. Ann is one of the people who was very influential in getting me on a mountain bike too. So I just want to acknowledge that we all pass along this this gift to each other. And thank you guys for coming and sharing with us. So I also want to thank some of the organizations and the people that made this event and make all of our virtual events possible. The Health Forward Foundation, Hall Family Foundation, Enterprise Bank, Shoemaker Family Foundation, My Sidewalk, and of course, BikeWalkKC members and sponsors and donors. Each of you who participate, who give, who sign up for the advocacy mailing list, you are each a big part of what we do. So speaking of the advocacy mailing list, if you were part of the recent push to save the Blue River Parkway trails and you contacted your Jackson County legislator, if you received an email encouraging you to do that from our advocacy list, thank you very much. If you did not receive that email, we would love to have you on our advocacy email list so that you can be aware of the next opportunity to speak up for trails, for transportation, and for your community. Thank you so much, each of you, for joining us. I'll be following up with an email tomorrow that will include a link to today's video, as well as other resources that we've talked about today. UTC contact information, trail guides, and all of that. Thank you so much, each of you, for joining us.
Liz, real quick, I did see a couple of questions that might not have got answered. I'm going to email you some answers to that if you want to include those in your email out to people.
Yeah, you bet. That would be perfect. And I'll send you a list of those questions to kind of put them all in order.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you.
We'll communicate and we'll get back to all of you tomorrow. Yes. Thank you so much for joining us, guys. Have a great day.